everybody. Nice to see everyone again. I apologize that I missed last week, but looking forward to learning today. And as always, we ask that our learning should be a zechut or le'iloi nishmat, those who have recently perished in this very, very long war. It should be a zechus for our chayalim. It should be a zechus for the return of our chatufim. And Hashem should heal all those who have been affected by this war. And of course, as we always end with, God should give guidance to our leaders to make the right decisions, Be'ezrat Hashem. Okay, what I wanted to do this week is we're going to be finishing up a topic that we had been discussing last class, 2 weeks ago. We were in the middle of a very, very long essay by Rav Soloveitchik. We're not going to read through the whole essay. We were in the middle of it, but I did want to highlight the second aspect of what Rav Soloveitchik talks about. 2 weeks ago, we were discussing the importance of davening in a Beit Knesset, and we were in the middle of a very, very beautiful essay by Rav Soloveitchik called "The Synagogue as an Institution and as an Idea." And what I'd like to do is just highlight. Rav Soloveitchik tried to talk about the concept of a shul, of a synagogue, in two different ways. We got to the first one, we didn't get to the second one. I'd like to finish and do that second point, which I think is a very, very beautiful concept. And then from there, we're going to then discuss another topic connected to shuls, which is the concept of Kedushat Beit Knesset, the holiness of the shul, what's appropriate to do in a shul, some practical issues that arise regarding appropriate behavior within a shul. So, before we get into Rav Soloveitchik, I'd like to first look at source number one, because the idea that we're going to see in Rav Soloveitchik is based off of this Gemara. The Gemara in source number one says something very interesting. Tanya, Rabbi Yishmael ben Elazar Omer, Be'avon shnei dvarim, ame ha'artzot metim. There are two sins that cause an am ha'aretz. An am ha'aretz is generally considered to be somebody who is ignorant, somebody who is not as knowledgeable, or another way of understanding it is the other nations. This is what causes them to die. Al shekorin la'aron hakodesh arna, that when they refer to the Aron Kodesh, when they refer to the Aron in a shul, they call it an arna. Again, we're not going to focus on that point, but there's some kind of name that they give, some nickname they give to the Aron Kodesh. The al shekorin le Beit Knesset Beit Am. Whenever they refer to a shul, they call it, instead of calling it a shul, instead of calling it a Beit Knesset, what do they call it? A Beit Am. Okay, that because of these names, there's something derogatory or considered or negative about these names that these people give, and therefore it's considered wrong. Rav Soloveitchik, in the second part of the essay, focuses on the second thing. He focuses on the second thing that this Gemara says. He says, what is wrong with calling a Beit Knesset Beit Am? How would you translate the Beit Am? A community center, right? A place for the community, a place for the nation. If anything, that sounds somewhat positive. What's wrong with calling a Beit Knesset Beit Am? That's Rav Soloveitchik's question. So please turn with me. I gave you the whole, this isn't the whole essay. I took a lot of different parts of it. But we're going to go to the second page, in the middle of source number two. In the middle of source number two, the second page. About 4 paragraphs down, 1, 2, 3, where Rav Soloveitchik starts with one line. Beit HaKnesset conveys a second meaning as well. Okay, so the first thing that Rav Soloveitchik noted when he talked about Beit HaKnesset is that a Beit HaKnesset does not mean the house of God. This is what we saw earlier, but rather it refers to the home of God. What's the difference between a house and a home? A home has a different type of a connotation. Home is where you go when you want to return to your roots. Home is where you go when you're looking for a certain sense of connection. And Rav Soloveitchik, we saw last time, actually suggests that a Beit HaKnesset isn't the home of God as much as it is the home of man where he meets God. That this is what we have designated as the place where we connect with Hashem, and therefore that is where the significance of the shul is. That was Rav Soloveitchik's first idea. But look at the second idea. And again, I'm bringing this to you because I think his words and the way he develops it is much better than any summary I could give you. It is a very long essay, so I did skip certain parts, but hopefully I was able to capture the essence. Beit HaKnesset conveys a second meaning as well. There was a strange passage in Tractate Shabbat, and that was the Gemara that we just saw. The Gemara says that if you refer to a Beit Knesset as a Beit Am, that is what causes people to die early. Ask the Gemara the following, or it says Rav Soloveitchik the following. The name of the second sin of substituting the word Beit Am for Beit HaKnesset is not obvious. What does Beit HaKnesset mean in simple language? House of assembly. Similarly, what does Beit Ha'am mean? A house of the people, a house of the multitude, a house of the, of the community. What is the semantic difference between Beit HaKnesset and Beit Ha'am? The Talmud considered the substitution of Am for Knesset a very serious offense. The answer to this problem lies in a halachic concept, namely the idea of shlichut. So Rav Soloveitchik now goes on to develop something that is very prominent in the world of halacha, which is the concept of shlichut. What is shlichut? What is a shaliach? A messenger, right? In today's society, a shaliach is someone you send to go deliver things for you. Okay? Sorry? Intermediary, also good, correct. A shaliach is somebody you send on behalf of yourself, yes. A representative, excellent, okay? And in the world of halacha, shaliach is very prominent as well. If I'm not able to do, there are certain mitzvot that I can't send a shaliach to do, but there are many mitzvot where if I'm unable to do it, I can send somebody on my behalf in order to do it for me. But what Rav Soloveitchik then goes on to develop is that the concept of shlichut in halacha is a little bit different than the way that we often refer to it in the rest of the world. The rest of the world, we refer to it as, I guess the best way is a proxy. And what's a proxy? A proxy is somebody who I give power to do things on my behalf. Rav Soloveitchik brings a number of examples where in the world of halacha, a shaliach does much more than that. Where the shaliach isn't just my proxy, he's not just doing it on my behalf, he's actually becoming me. That in certain areas of halacha, where I am necessary to be a part of or to do a certain action, my ability to appoint a shaliach means the shaliach almost becomes me in certain ways. The shaliach represents me, and not just like, oh, you can sign on my behalf. When you sign this document or when you do this action, you are doing it in my place. And based off of that, Rav Soloveitchik continues. No, to continue where we were up to in the source. The whole institution of Tefillah B'tzibur and the synagogue, which is dedicated to Tefillah B'tzibur, rests upon the idea of shlichut. Let me explain. What is a tzibur? And this is an important distinction that Soloveitchik makes. Of course, in the vernacular, we identify tzibur with minyan. Right? When we talk about davening with tzibur, often what we mean is davening with a minyan. What is a minyan? 10 people. And there's usually an interchange. We refer to davening with a minyan, davening with a tzibur. It's the same thing. We do not say tzibur. Tzibur is the scholarly phrase for which minyan is the colloquial expression. Meaning we usually say, I have to find a minyan. And what we mean is, I'm davening with the tzibur. So what then is a minyan? Says Soloveitchik, 10 Jews together. The number 10. When you have 10, that is a minyan. Is this equation of tzibur with minyan correct? Technically, it is correct. However, philosophically, it is wrong. Perhaps it is wrong not only philosophically, but halachically as well. In order to understand the word tzibur, we have to give our attention to the term korban tzibur. So Soloveitchik is suggesting that even though we often interchange the concept of minyan and tzibur, they are actually not the same. Minyan refers to 10 people coming and doing something. Tzibur means something much, much different and much more significant. He says, for example, there's a concept of korban tzibur. What is a korban tzibur? Anyone know?
The whole community has to give.
Korban tzibur refers to the concept that there are many different types of korbanot that were brought. There were korbanot yachid, when an individual would come to the Beit HaMikdash and bring a korban. And then there were korbanot that the entirety of the people needed to bring. For example, the korban tamid, the korban that was brought out every single day, was brought on behalf of the entire people. All of the korbanot of the chagim, a korban musaf is a korban tzibur. If there were certain sins that occurred throughout the entire community, there were korbanot that needed to be brought on behalf of the entire. Those are referred to as korban tzibur. We don't call that. So it says Rav Soloveitchik, really, what is a tzibur? Tzibur doesn't just mean 10 people. Tzibur, in its real sense of the word, means the entirety of the Jewish people. Tzibur is a reference to OUIsrael as a whole. Just to read his words. Of course, tzibur with regards to korban is to be equated with Edah, with Adat Yisrael, and not with a minyan. Refers to the entire community. In other words, tzibur vis-a-vis korban signifies the entire Jewish covenantal community. If 10 people get together, he makes a different point. This is his important point. If 10 people get together and jointly bring a sacrifice, let's say 10 individuals decide to bring a korban together, that's not called a korban tzibur. That's called a chavura, or another more accurate in term. Well, that's for korban pesach. It's called a chavura, but a more accurate term would be it's called a korban shutfin. What's a korban shutfin? A korban of partners, 10 people who decided to bring it together. So there's a big difference between when 10 people decide to bring a korban, that's called a korban shutfin, but yet when the community as a whole brings a korban, that's a korban tzibur. The latter would not, so he says if 10 people would get together and jointly bring a sacrifice, the latter would not be considered a korban tzibur. That is a korban shutfin, since the term tzibur halachically is related to the entirety of the Jewish community. Now we have to get back to the concept of tefillah b'tzibur. Hence the term tzibur of tefillah tzibur refers not to 10 people, but to the Klal Yisrael, or rather Knesset Yisrael. And now Rav Soloveitchik says something very astounding. He says every single time we daven as a group, and we call that korban tzibur, we're not just davening as a group of 10 people who are davening together. We're actually representing the entirety of Klal Yisrael. God hearkens to prayer of the entire community as a whole, to prayer offered by the Adat Yisrael in its entirety. No one must be excluded. For example, we say specifically on Yom Kippur, and in general by Slichot, V'nislach l'chol Adat b'nei Yisrael. And then we say, V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. That God will only be sanctified throughout all of Am Yisrael, or b'toch b'nei Yisrael, amongst b'nei Yisrael. Only within all of the people, in the midst of the community, will I be sanctified. And the halacha derives from these words the famous conclusion, Ein davar shebiktusha pachot me'asara. That there is no concept, you can't say a davar shebiktusha, you can't say kedusha, you can't say kaddish. There are things that anything which is called a davar shebiktusha has a certain level of sanctity, cannot be said without a tzibur, without a community. I'm sorry? Oh, you mean who said that tzibur? That's an interesting. I don't know. I never heard that. That the word tzibur is an acronym for. I mean, it fits in with the idea that we say, especially when we say that we're davening with the Avaryanim, we're davening all together. The idea, that's a beautiful idea. I never heard that tzibur. What it does is it brings. We spoke about how one of the values of a tzibur is that the power of the collective enables us to be able to overcome the deficiencies of the yichidim, and therefore it enables people. Right, the power of a collective enables us to overcome the deficiencies of specific individuals who are davening. That is beautiful. That tzibur enables everyone to come together in a beautiful way. Yafeh. Assembly, correct. Very nice. Okay, let's keep going in Rav Soloveitchik because he's going to highlight it beautifully. He says the question is obvious. We're on the last paragraph of the second page. On the one hand, the Torah states, only in the midst of all of the people, B'soch b'nei Yisrael, shall I be sanctified, and not in the presence of just part of the people. It doesn't say B'soch chelek mi b'nei Yisrael. And yet, on the other hand, the halacha says that the recital of Kedusha, we're allowed to say Dvarim Shebikdusha in the presence of just 10 old men. How can we reconcile the words of the Torah that Kedusha must be recited in the presence of the entire community, excuse the typo, to the exclusion of no one, with our daily practice where we are satisfied with 10 people? The answer lies in the self-evident fact that halacha, in permitting 10 people, we're on the next page now, to recite Kedusha, to say Amen Yehesh Me'raba, to answer, we're on page, I think it's page 3, the top, to answer Baruch Hashem HaMevarach Li'olam Va'ed, operated with the idea of shlichut. Now we're getting back to the concept of shlichut. That when 10 men or a group of Jews get together to daven, they are now officially the shlichim of all of Am Yisrael. They represent all of Am Yisrael, operating with the idea of shlichut, which, as I said, is not to be equated with proxy shlichut. The 10 are the representatives of the Klal Yisrael. They are the shluchim of the people as a whole. And in keeping with our interpretation of shlichut, they are not only representatives, they're not only ambassadors of Klal Yisrael, they are the Klal Yisrael. In a strange, mystical way, they impersonate, not fictionally, but artistically, but not artistically, but existentially, and become Klal Yisrael. In other words, when 10 people in a shul offer their prayers, the entire Knesset Yisrael prays with them. They are the Knesset Yisrael. That is why Kedusha is permitted through them. And then he goes on to say, I didn't bring this for you, where he actually goes on to suggest that this isn't just true of them representing Am Yisrael who are alive today, but they represent all of Am Yisrael, what's known colloquially as Knesset Yisrael, all the way from the back to the beginning of Jewish history until the end of Jewish history, because we as Knesset Yisrael exist beyond time. Fundamentally, there is only one prayer. Fundamentally, there is only one tzibur, the invisible Knesset Yisrael, embracing the past, the present, and the future, prays with every minyan. The tzibur in the synagogue is the micro Knesset Yisrael of 10, which represents, personifies the macro community of the invisible Knesset Yisrael. And now, says Soloveitchik, we can get back to our initial question. The initial question we asked on the Gemara was, what's wrong with calling it Beit Ha'am instead of calling it Beit Knesset? Says Soloveitchik, when you call it Beit Ha'am and you don't refer to it in its proper name of Beit Knesset, you're missing out on one of the most fundamental aspects of davening in a Beit Knesset with a tzibur. And that is that when we daven with a tzibur in the Beit HaKnesset, we are capturing the essence of Knesset Yisrael. We become Knesset Yisrael. Looking at the shul as simply a place to gather, not that gathering is wrong. And by the way, we're going to highlight soon, we're going to talk a little bit about how a shul does act as a place of gathering. Beit HaKnesset also means a place of gathering. But says Soloveitchik, it means so much more. Look at final paragraph. We asked above why the halacha is so meticulous regarding the name Beit HaKnesset. What is wrong with Beit Ha'am? Why did our sages say that it was a serious offense to substitute Beit Ha'am for Beit HaKnesset? The answer is now simple. The Beit HaKnesset is the home of the great, invisible Knesset Yisrael, through all ages and millennia. A Beit Ha'am is a house for contemporaries. However, to pray with contemporaries is not enough. One must pray with the entire covenantal community, which is present in the Beit HaKnesset, and the Kedushat of Beit HaKnesset is due to that mysterium tremendum. That's Rav Soloveitchik's wonderful language. The latter suspends all three time dimensions. The past is not gone yet. The future has yet arrived. And we, the 10 people, the minyan who live in the present, unite both, past and future. A Beit HaKnesset is the home of prayer, as was pointed above, because it is the home, and this is the point where he's bringing the two together. The reason it's the home of prayer is because it is the home of the great Knesset Yisrael. And ipso facto, the home where Almighty has a rendezvous with the Knesset Yisrael. And so Rav Soloveitchik, in very, very beautiful fashion, as you can see why I thought it was important that we see some of this language inside, is highlighting one of the most important aspects of what a shul is. We've talked before about how davening in a shul is about connecting everyone together, the power of the community and the impact that has. Rav Soloveitchik has taken this to a new level, that when we daven with a minyan in a shul, what we are doing is we are tapping into the entirety of Knesset Yisrael. We are representing, we become Knesset Yisrael in a very, very powerful way. In some kind of mystical way, we connect all of Am Yisrael, we represent all of Am Yisrael. And there's something very, very powerful about that, both on a mystical level, as well as practically, thinking about and understanding that when we daven, we've talked about this before, how the texts that we're saying are tapping into the history of all of Am Yisrael, the text itself, the davening that we do, although it's different it was different in communities throughout the years, fundamentally, the things we're saying, it's what defines and connects all of Am Yisrael. And therefore, I thought that this was an important aspect for us to be highlighting of the power of davening with a minyan and the power of davening in a Beit HaKnesset, recognizing that when we daven in a Beit HaKnesset, what we're doing is we're tapping into and we're becoming part of the greater Knesset Yisrael. So that was just something that I wanted to finish because we had been in the middle of it last week, and I wanted to highlight that. What I'd like to do now is pivot to a connected. This question or comment, please.
You mentioned as one of the last things that it's referred to as a house of prayer.
Beit HaTfilah. I mean,
why not use it as it said Beit Tfilah?
Why don't we? Why is that not the colloquial phrase?
And why? That's number one. And number two, why did it hang up on the title?
So first of all, well, I could answer your first question with your second question, but so I think that I think number one, it is a Beit HaTfilah, and there's no question. But I would say two things. This is my own understanding of it. First of all, I think the hang-up is because, as Rav Soloveitchik says, sometimes the hang-up is because you want to be able to highlight and remind yourself of all the different ideas. Meaning, if we just refer to it as a Beit Ha'am, that's true. It is a Beit Ha'am. But Rav Soloveitchik is pointing out that it's so much more. And sometimes the way that we talk about things and the way that we describe things impacts our vision of them, what we do, how we approach them. And therefore, it's important. Again, I don't know But it's that the source of number one is Nagadata. Okay, Nagadata doesn't necessarily mean that if we actually call it Beit Ha'am one time, that means that all of a sudden we're going to die young. What it means is it's capturing something about what it's a lesson about what the shul is supposed to be and how we're supposed to look at it. Does that mean we can never call it that? I think it means is this is when we think about a shul, we think about a Beit Knesset. This is the vision we should be having, and that's where I think Rav Soloveitchik is highlighting. So I think it is. I think it is. Now the challenge becomes, and this is what we're actually going to get to today, which is, well, what happens if you do too much with it? What does that mean? For example, we're going to get to today the concept of the Kedushat of the Beit HaKnesset, and what can be done at a Beit HaKnesset. Meaning, maybe a Beit HaKnesset should only be a place where you pray. Can you eat in a Beit HaKnesset? Can I talk with my friends in a Beit HaKnesset? Meaning, you are pointing out that sometimes, if you just look at it as something much larger than just a place to daven, what you lose is remembering what the main point is, which is to daven. So you have to have both. There's no question. There's no question that a Beit HaKnesset, and what we're going to also, I think, see, that Beit HaKnesset, I think, is more than just a house of prayer, but it is fundamentally a house of prayer. And I don't think we can lose that. I hope I'm answering your question. I think you're right that we have to make sure that we don't lose the fact that ultimately, right? I joke about this, but sometimes we talk about it that, like, in some places people come to shul and they don't even come to daven. They come to sit in the back and schmooze.
You mentioned in the introduction to this topic the difference between American and Israeli shuls, and that's the difference between a Bet Knesset and more than just a Beit.
Okay, so yes, I do believe, and again, it's shifting here dramatically. I do believe that what's generally understood is that whereas in America, shuls have become much more than just a Beit Tefillah, have become a community center on some level, even though you have JCCs, but they've become much more than that, which is why the structures are significantly different, the role of the rabbi is significantly different, the overall attitude towards it is significantly different, whereas here it's become a place to daven. Now, that's not a bad thing, right? Because sometimes I think when you have the shuls in America that become much more, people forget about the fact that you're supposed to be davening and not just coming for Kiddush and coming for, although those things are important, the davening is the main thing. The question is that you want to find that right balance. I think people here, and especially it's happening, I think, as more people make aliyah, and more people who come from those Anglo communities and that vision of what it was make aliyah, and they're saying, I want something more. The reason shuls used to not be that, the reason shuls in Israel were generally just places to daven is because that was what was needed, or at least that's what they felt they needed. Okay? They said we have the iriyah. When you live in a Jewish country, so certain things that you're used to your shul doing, taking care of weddings, taking care of burial, taking care of mikvah, many things that the shul was a part of. Now the iriyah does. Now the city does. And therefore, what do I need the shul for? I need the shul to daven. But what people, I think, have realizing more and more is that shul is not just a place to daven, it's a place to connect. It's a place to be able to connect. And I think, again, to each their own. Right? If there's a community and people feel like they're able to spiritually get what they need to get, and it comes from without having a rabbi and just having matov v'manayim. But I think people made these shuls didn't even realize what they were missing, and now they're coming to a realization that there is a value to having more of a community feel to the shuls. Yes.
Two things. First of all, in my experience, there was a Beit Knesset and a Beit Medrash, and the Beit Medrash was more loose at few
In terms of rules.
The other thing I wanted to ask you is, did nobody between the time of the Gemara and Rabbi Soloveitchik address this problem, this question about why it's so severe, such a severe?
Oh, you mean to explain that Gemara? I'm sure there were. I'm sure there were. I'll be very honest. I didn't do my due diligence in researching all the answers to this Gemara. Meaning, I was really building. The focus for me was on this essay that I wanted to highlight what he was doing, and I brought you that Gemara. I'm sure there's different explanations for exactly what the issue is. On that Gemara, it says something similar. Yeah, so he says, or first says something similar. I'm sure the basic achronim and again, I'm sure there are many people who give other explanations, but this was a Soloveitchik's explanation. Who initiated the term Beit HaKnesset? I mean, it exists in the Gemara, it exists in the early sources. Who actually came up with the term Beit HaKnesset? I'm not sure. It's a good question. I know that. Remember hearing that Rav Hirsch refers to the fact that we call it a shul, and a shul is from the language of a school, which is it's meant to teach you. Okay, so that's very interesting also. Right. No. So you're asking a very good question. You're touching on something else, which is I think you're also asking, for example, what was there historically when there was a Beit HaMikdash? Was there also a shul? And historically, their understanding was there were shuls. What were the shuls? Shuls were places where people gathered to say certain tefillot, even though much was said in the Beit HaMikdash. But this is a great transition, because what you're basically asking is our shul modeled after the Beit HaMikdash? Because if it is, then in terms of rules and Kedushat and things you can or can't do, maybe modeled after that, which would make it much more restrictive. And that's what I'd like to do, is I'd like to now look at a little bit of the sources, trying to understand the status of a shul, the status of a Beit HaKnesset, and therefore the repercussions and ramifications of what can or can't be done in a shul, which I think we all agree we tend to be rather lax in terms of what we do in a shul. The question is that justified, and where does that come from? Yes, last question before we go on. Absolutely. All interconnected. Absolutely. I think the fact that
I don't feel a conflict like he does. I feel that when you're in shul and you concentrate on prayer, you also are concentrating on relating to Hashem, saying, I am part of
absolutely. Absolutely. I think they're all correct. I think everybody is different, and that's why each person needs to understand what they connect with. But I 100% agree that I personally also find that when I'm davening with the community, the social aspect impacts the bin adam lachavero impacts the bin adam lamakom. There's a lot of interaction. Some people are different. Some people say, no, when I'm around people, I get distracted and I can't focus. Everybody has to, or down at home, or find an area that's less distracting for you within the shul. Meaning everybody has to figure out but I agree with you that social piece is a major. They are very much hand in hand and do feed off of each other. That's an excellent point. Okay, so the Gemara here, we're going to now move to source number 3. The Gemara, we know that we've seen before that the shul is referred to as a mikdash me'at. We saw that in earlier sources when we discussed the beginning of the importance of a shul, which means that the shul is considered to be a mini sanctuary, sanctuary. Whenever I say sanctuary, I think of in America, that's what they refer to as the main shul. We call it the main sanctuary. I think to this day, that's still the word that's used when we refer to the main minyan, the main sanctuary where the shul is. Okay, so then we know that on some level, a shul is meant to be modeled after the Beit HaMikdash. The question is, how far do we take that in terms of what's allowed to be done or not allowed to be done in a shul? So look at the Gemara in source number 3. It's a Gemara Masechet Megillah. And the Gemara is discussing what you're allowed to sell, or if you sell something of a certain level of Kedushat, what can be purchased with that money. Because if you sell something that has a certain level of Kedushat, you can only purchase things that have also a certain level of Kedushat with that money, because the money achieves a certain level of sanctity as well. So the Mishnah says the following. B'nei ha'ir shemachru rechova shel ir. If the people of a city sold a certain street, lokchim b'demav Beit Knesset, then you're allowed to then use that money to buy a shul. Why? Because when you purchase the shul, it's going up in its Kedusha, because before it was just a regular street, and now you're buying a shul. Beit HaKnesset, lokchin teva. If you sold a Beit HaKnesset, you're allowed to purchase a teva. Okay, a teva is a reference to an area, either the Aron Kodesh or a teva that holds certain objects of Kedusha. Okay? Teva, lochin mitpachot yichu sfarim lochim Torah. Again, we're going up in levels of holiness, that as you sell something of a lower level of holiness, you're also allowed to then purchase something which is a higher level of holiness, but you can't do the opposite. For example, if you sell a Sefer Torah, you can't buy an aro, you can't buy a teva, because the Sefer Torah has a higher level of holiness. Aval, that's what it says at the very end. Imrachru Torah lo yichu sfar. If you sell Torah, you can't just buy svarim with that money. Svarim lo yichu mitpachot lo yichu teva lo yichu. I believe mitpachot is a reference to the covering of the Sefer Torah. Okay, lo yichu teva lo yichu Beit HaKnesset lo yiknu et harechov v'chein b'mot rehen. But basically, when you have something of Kedusha, you can only purchase something of a higher level of Kedusha with that money. You can't purchase something of a lower level of Kedusha with that money. Okay, what we see from this Gemara, without getting into all of the practical details, is that already on this list, Beit HaKnesset has some level of Kedusha. It has some level of holiness. Because we could have said, it's a room where we daven, and that's it. But we see clearly from this Mishnah, there is some level of holiness, and there is a machlokes, an argument in the Rishonim, how high the level of holiness that the shul is. For example, in source number 4, the Ramban says something very, very interesting. We're just going to look at the underlined part of the Ramban. The second paragraph in source number 4. V'yesh li yashiv, the Ramban is bringing a number of different sources that seem to contradict each other regarding the status of the holiness of a shul. And he says, V'yesh lomar, de Beit HaKnesset asu oto kitashmishe mitzvah. The status of a shul is that of what we call a tashmish mitzvah. Tashmish mitzvah means that it's an object that is used for a mitzvah, which means it is imbued with holiness while you're using it. But once you finish using it, it no longer maintains that holiness. For example, he says, lulav or sukkah. For example, the walls of a sukkah. Okay? So the walls of a sukkah on sukkahs, while it's being used for a mitzvah, have a certain level of holiness, and there are things you can or cannot do with those walls. The second sukkah is over, and you're no longer using this for the mitzvah of sukkah. You're allowed to use those walls to do whatever you want with them. They no longer maintain or retain their kedusha. They only have their kedusha during the time that they are being used for the mitzvah. You still should dispose of them in a more respectful way than you would something else. For example, the lulav, very often we say you should put it in a bag and then put it in the garbage, or many people have the minhag to hold on to it, if you manage to be able to do this, to hold on to it and burn it on Erev Pesach, that we take one mitzvah and use it for another mitzvah. That's not a halacha, that's a minhag. But you still should treat it with a certain level of kavod, because it was used for a mitzvah. But the level of it no longer has any kedusha once the mitzvah is over. Says the Ramban, the same thing is of a shul. While the shul is being used for the mitzvah of tefillah, so it has a certain status of kedusha. The second the community decides they no longer want to use this space for the mitzvah of tefillah, then, okay, you should treat it with more respect than maybe other things, but it no longer has a level of kedusha. Now, this is a very important point regarding the question of what you can do. Let's say the shul decides it wants to sell it, sell the building. Are you allowed to do that? There's a big debate about whether that's allowed or not. According to the Ramban, it's more allowed, because once the community decides I'm no longer using this space for tefillah, then you would be allowed to do certain things that you normally wouldn't be allowed for a place that has kedusha. 1 second. So that's the opinion of the Ramban. That's the most lenient opinion regarding the status or the level of kedusha that we have in the Beit HaKnesset, which is it's like tashmishe kedusha, tashmishe mitzvah. When you're using it, it has kedusha. When you stop using it, it no longer has that same kedusha. Other Rishonim disagree. The Ran, for example, in source number 5, again, we're only going to see the highlights. The Ran, in source number 5, he quotes the Ramban, and he asks a number of questions on the Ramban. And then he says, "Ve'ein devarav berurim etzli." He says, I disagree with the Ramban. I don't think what the Ramban's analysis is correct. Lefik, and then again, we're just getting to the main part. Lefikach nirali, this is the underlined part. De Beit HaKnesset udikavate. He says, therefore, I believe that a shul and something similar, kevan she'ikaro asuai, lomar bo davar shebiktusha, hitilu bo chachamim kidusha b'divrehem. Since this is a location where we invoke the name of God and we say dvarim shebiktusha, therefore, midrabanan, rabbinically, the shul has a certain level of kedusha. More than just tashmish mitzvah. It's not just when you're using it, it has it. Even when you're not using it, even when they decide not to, there's a rabbinic level of kedusha that is imbued in the shul by virtue of the fact that it is used for dvarim shebiktusha, for virtue of the fact of what it is used for in terms of davening and coming and connecting to Hashem. But many Rishonim, and this is the third opinion, the most severe, actually suggest that the kedusha that a shul has is midoraisa, is biblical, and it is patterned after the kedusha of the Beit HaMikdash. Look at source number 6. Source number 6 is the Sefer Yereim, also one of the Rishonim. And he has a list of the different mitzvot, and one of the mitzvot that he lists is Morab Mikdash, is having fear or awe of the Beit HaMikdash. In his description of describing the mitzvah of having awe and fear of the Beit HaMikdash, he mentions shul. Look at the underlined part. The pasuk says, "V'yareta me elokecha." You should have fear of God. Tziva b'hikanes adam lemikdash. When a person enters the Beit HaMikdash, and then he says, "O b'Beit HaKnesset, O b'Beit HaMidrash, sheyinhag bahem mora v'kavod." That you need to have a certain fear for, just like you would. He even compares it to the Beit HaMikdash. You have to have a fear when you walk into the shul or walk into a Beit Knesset or a Beit Medrash. Again, we're skipping just for time purposes. Look at the next underlined part. Lamadnu kishe'amra Torah at mikdashi tira, when the Torah says you should fear or have awe for my mikdash, shebatei knesiot uvatei midrashot bichlal. Included in that command is what we refer to as the Beit Knesset, what we refer to as Beit Medrash, that there is a biblical Kedushat to a shul and to a base medrash. So we have three opinions so far we've seen in the Rishonim. One opinion is the level of Kedushat that the Beit HaMikdash, that a shul has is similar to Tashmish mitzvah, which means when you do it, it has Kedushat, but when you stop using it, it no longer has its Kedushat, which is the most lenient. The second opinion is that of the Ran, which is there is rabbinic Kedushat that is imbued upon the shul because of how we use it. And the third is the Yereim, who suggests, no, there is actual Midoraisa Kedushat on a shul, parallel to, in similar fashion, like there was in the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, yes, there was a comment or a question. You mean they bought a mosque or a church in order to build a shul, or the opposite? Right. Okay. So you're again, we're not. I don't want to get too much into too much of the practical. There's a whole big question regarding if there is Kedusha, what can be done, meaning with it, how can you sell it, when can you sell it, if you can sell it, what it can be used for, etc. They're all great questions. I don't want to get into all of those details just simply because I wanted to focus more on, not that that's not important, but I think for us, it's more a question of things that we do, eating, talking. These are certain practical things that I wanted. But it is a very good question. I'll even say more than that. There was a big halachic discussion. This is a big question. Was when during 2005 in the disengagement, when in Gaza, when in the whole area of Gaza, all the Jews were taken out. And the question was, what do you do with the shuls? And Rav Yaakov Ariel has a whole tshuva. The question was, we know what's going to happen if we leave them, which is actually what happened was we left them, and what did the Arabs do? They went in and they just totally destroyed them. On the other hand, you're not supposed to destroy a shul. So if we actively destroy it, should we actively destroy it? And that was a big halachic discussion. In the end, Rav Ariel told them that they should leave it, because whatever they would do is not worse than what we would do. I mean, I think that's debatable. I mean, I think it was disgrace, but in the end of the day, the way the methods that they have to destroy it, which was burning it and anything like that, it's probably the way that we would have done something, or they used bulldozers to totally destroy it and raise it, is what we would have done anyway. But it's a very, very important halachic question of what you're allowed to do, and it all revolves around this. Meaning, according to the Ramban, once the shul decides this is no longer a place where we're davening, you should be able to sell it and do whatever you want with it. But according to the Yereim, who's the most stringent, who says this is just like a Beit HaMikdash, a mini Mikdash, then it would be more stringent. And that's just a question of how we paskin. I think we generally paskin like the Yereim in many different ways, which is that we do look at it in a very stringent way, that we have to keep a certain kedusha, which means there must be certain ways that that people who sell it to a church or to other things, I don't know exactly how what halachic basis they're using, but there must be some way that they're able to do it. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is get to the question of for us also, because based on what we're seeing so far, this has the status of like the Beit HaMikdash. Doesn't mean literally the Beit HaMikdash where you had to go to the mikveh before you went to the Beit HaMikdash, take off your shoes, but it means that this has a level mid-d'oraisa of Kedusha, of holiness. And yet, I'm sure many of us are familiar with many shuls where you walk in, people are eating, people are talking. I'll even say more, there are many shuls that are, considered very, very frum, and right after davening, what do? They put away, they move the tables to the side, and they have kiddush, or they have shalashuddis in the shul, in the sanctuary. How is that allowed? How is it allowed? And is there an allowance for that? So the main basis for that actually comes from another Gemara. We're going to skip to that Gemara right now in source number 10. And the Gemara says the following. This is going to be the basis for understanding many of the leniencies that we have specifically regarding how we act in shul. Amar Rav Asi, source number 10. Batei knesiot shebebavel. All of the shuls in Bavel, and here Bavel seems to be an understanding, it's referring to all the shuls in Chutz La'aretz, not necessarily just Bavel. Al Tanai Heim Asuyim. They were built al Tanai, on condition. V'afal pikein, ein nohagim bahem kalot rosh. But nevertheless, we shouldn't treat them frivolous. We shouldn't act frivolously in the shul. Umayni, what does it mean that they were built al Tanai? Says the Gemara, cheshbonot, to take an accounting. Says the Gemara the following concept. When we built the shul, it was built, and this is assumed, says the Gemara, for all shuls built in Bavel. Why specifically Bavel and Chutz La'aretz? Because those shuls, we believe, are ultimately going to be, according to Chazal, are going to be uprooted and transplanted back in Yerushalayim. And therefore they had to be built al Tanai. What it means is that when I built a shul in America, or when my community in Englewood, New Jersey built a beautiful shul that they have, it was built al Tanai with an understanding that it's not going to be imbued with the full Kedusha. There was an understanding that every shul built in Chutz La'aretz does not attain the status of Kedusha that we normally give to a shul, because it was built with this understanding that it's going to be moved, it's going to be treated differently. By the way, what that does highlight is that already, we talk about the difference between Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael, that means that every shul in the Chutz La'aretz has a lower level of Kedusha, although we're going to see that many of our shuls today here in Eretz Yisrael also are built al Tanai with a certain condition. Once you build it al Tanai, says the Gemara, therefore, although you should not act frivolously in the shul, many of those things which shouldn't be done in a standard shul can be done in a shul that's built al Tanai, because you stipulated from the beginning that you didn't want to imbue this building or this shul with the standard Kedusha. And that is what enables you to do certain things. For example, the Gemara says cheshbonot, to deal with certain accountings, to talk about certain divrei chol, not necessarily inappropriate things, but things that are more mundane, you're allowed to do in a shul if it was built al Tanai.
So is there a yitron, is there an advantage in going to a shul which was not built?
It's a good question. I would say it's probably a double-edged sword, because on the one hand you could say, and again, we're going to see soon that according to many of the modern poskim, almost all of our shuls are built with that certain understanding of al Tanai. We'll see why. On the one hand, you could argue it has a lower level of kedusha. On the other hand, you're less accountable for the things you might do or say. So it's a very, very good question. On the one hand, we all want to daven. It's the same thing like going to the kotel, right? You want to daven, you want to go to the kotel, you want to go to the holiest place, and you want to have the place that mystically has the highest level of kedusha. On the other hand, you also have to be much more careful about how you act in those places. So which one is better for a person to daven in? I would leave that to you, to everyone to think about themselves. But I think we are being safer by having shuls that are built al Tanai, especially when we're dealing with a full community. The question is, what exactly does this mean? Meaning, what does it mean when we say that it's built al Tanai? So one understanding in the Rishonim, and this is the Rush, and this is the Rush is in Rishon, in source number 11. We're not going to see it inside. He basically understands this Gemara differently than this is the standard approach. He says, when it says al Tanai, that you can build a shul al Tanai, and that enables you to do certain things that you normally can't do in shul, he says that's only once it's destroyed. Normally, a shul that has full kedusha, once it's been destroyed, you still cannot do certain things. But if you build it al Tanai, you can. What that means for us is that practically it doesn't help us in any way while the shul is still standing. While a shul is still standing, says the Rush, even if it's built on condition, you still have to treat it with the same kedusha as you would any shul. You don't get any advantage by building it al Tanai. That's the Rush's opinion. However, other Rishonim say no. This concept of building a shul al Tanai is a game changer. When you build a shul al Tanai, now obviously you can't act frivolously. You can't do inappropriate things in a shul. But things that would be considered mundane can be done in a shul, because when you built it, you stipulated that you were building it al Tanai. The question is, who do we paskin like? Do we paskin like the Rush, who is more strict, who seems to say that even if you build a shul al Tanai, you still need to treat it with the same level of kedusha? Or do we paskin like the other Rishonim, who say no, if you build it al Tanai, then that enables you to do more within the shul without violating its kedusha? So interestingly enough, the Shulchan Aruch, who is the main source for our as our halachic decisor, he paskins like the Rush. He seems to be strict. He paskins like the Rush, and he says even if you build a shul al Tanai, that only enables you to be lenient about it once it's destroyed. But when the shul is still standing, you have to be just as careful as you would for any shul. Comes the Mishnah Berurah, and the Mishnah Berurah says, I apologize, I'm going a little bit fast just because of time. The Mishnah Berurah comes and comments in the Bir Halacha and says, that's not the minhag. He says, if you look all around, most of the Achronim are of the opinion that if you build a shul al Tanai, if you stipulate that when you build the shul, you're building it with a certain understanding that you're not imbuing it with the standard level of kedusha, that enables you, even while the shul is standing, to be able to do more mundane things within the sanctuary. And that is what we hold. Now, just one comment. I just want to make a couple of other comments. And there's a fascinating tshuva in source number 17. I'm just going to mention it quickly by the Divrei Chaim. The Divrei Chaim was the Tzanzer Rebbe, the previous Tzanzer Rebbe, the Tzanzer Rebbe who was a Nitzol Shoah, who was saved from the Holocaust. Unfortunately, his wife and 10 children were killed in the Holocaust. He then moved to Netanya and got remarried, rebuilt his family, and rebuilt the community of Tzanz. There's now a community called Kiryat Tzanz in Netanya, North Netanya, a beautiful, flourishing community. Was all founded by the Divrei Chaim. He also founded Laniado Hospital, which is a hospital there in Netanya. And he makes the following suggestion. He says that our shuls nowadays do not have the status of a Beis HaKnesset. Because when we build a shul nowadays, we have in mind that we're not just going to be davening there, but we're going to be gathering there. We're going to be schmoozing with each other. We're going to be socializing. That the way in which we envision, the way, especially I would say in Chutz La'aretz, where the shul has become the community. Now, by the way, when I talk about a shul, I don't even mean the other rooms. The other rooms obviously can be used for, meaning the outside hall, the downstairs. Those can certainly all be used for whatever we would, for other things. We're talking about the sanctuary. What can the sanctuary, because the sanctuary is what's called the Beit HaKnesset. And says the Divrei Chaim, even the sanctuary, when nowadays when we build shuls, we build it with the intention that it is going to be a place for us to gather, a place for us to talk, to schmooze. Now, obviously, it should be appropriate, but it's okay if we do those things within the shul, because that is what we have in mind when we build it. I'm sure this is certainly true of almost all communities. When they build their shul, they're not always thinking about just the tefillah, but about everything surrounding it, which is also, as you pointed out, part of what increases and helps the experience. The last comment I want to make, or the last source I want to see, which is very interesting, is a tshuva by Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked whether or not a person who is blind is allowed to bring his seeing dog, or whatever the terminology is, forgive me, seeing eye dog, I think, into shul. Or is that a violation of the Kedushat of the shul? And Rav Moshe, here points out that the minhag has been that we use the shul for other things. For example, he points out that many shuls, after davening, they clear away the tables and they have a kiddush, or they have a shalosh shudis. And that's considered acceptable as long as it's done within the framework of Kedusha on some level, of Avodat Hashem. And therefore he says the same thing would be true here. We as a community, by that I mean the larger Jewish community, when we build our shuls, we have in mind that the shul is going to be used not just for tefillah, but for some of these other things. And therefore, automatically, the shul or the sanctuary is not imbued with the same level of holiness that and necessarily a standard shul would have been in earlier times when the Gemara was referring to a shul. So just to summarize, then I'll take any questions. We dealt with the question of what is the level of holiness that the shul has. On the one hand, we know that the shul is modeled after the Beit HaMikdash. It's called a Mikdash Me'at. So we saw a number of different interpretations. There are some who say that the level of Kedusha of a shul is, on the one hand, is really just Tashmish Mitzvah. It's while you use it, it has Kedusha, but once you don't need it for the Mitzvah, it no longer has Kedusha. That was the lenient opinion. The more stringent opinion said, no, it's modeled after the Beit HaMikdash. The same Mitzvah d'oraisa to fear the Beit HaMikdash requires us to fear and to have awe for the Beit HaKnesset, which created a lot of questions regarding how we act in the shul. So we noted that there is a Gemara that talks about building a shul al Tanai, that if you build the shul from the beginning al Tanai on condition, that maybe would allow you to do certain things that you couldn't do in a regular shul, and that we noted that pretty much all shuls that are built nowadays are done with that in mind. And there's different understandings exactly what's allowed al Tanai, but the more standard approach, which is what many of the Achronim here in the Divrei Chaim and Rav Moshe say, is that when we build a shul nowadays, we're not just building it for tefillah, we're building it as a place for people to come together. And it is within that the shul is built, and therefore we're more lenient in what we allow. Obviously, things should be appropriate, nothing frivolous, nothing inappropriate. But within what's allowed, having a conversation in the back, maybe sometimes eating, depending on every shul has their own standards. I think in this shul, actually in this sanctuary, no eating is allowed. So no eating is allowed whatsoever. But depending on the standards the shul has, but from a halachic perspective, it may be allowed because the shul has been created as something that is much more than just a place of tefillah. And with that, I think also we're highlighting, and just to end with this, we're highlighting another aspect, which is what you were talking about before. We've been talking about the power of a shul. A shul is so much more than just a place to daven. It is a place to daven, and it's first and foremost a place to daven. I remember one of my Rabbi in elementary school used to go around when guys were talking and say, if you talk here, where do you daven? Right? So first and foremost, the shul is a place to daven. But it certainly is so much more than that. And when we talk about davening in a shul, there's so much more we gain by being a part of the shul and davening in a shul than just simply the tefillah b'tzibur, which obviously has tremendous koach as well. I'm sorry I didn't have time for questions. I'm happy to take questions separately, but I want to give everyone a break now. Have a great week, everybody. Oh, just a technical point. It's going to be announced as well, but I'm actually I'm leaving to the States at the end of this week, so this will be our last session for the summer. But Be'ezrat Hashem, I'm looking forward to seeing everyone in the fall. Enjoy. Thank you.